class, this is Dr. McGonigal with another Research Methods 2 lecture for you. Today we are going to talk about writing outlines. So outlining is extremely important to do before writing your introduction. The outline that you will write will provide you with a detailed guide for your writing the structure and the architecture or bones of your introduction. Outlining helps ensure a logical flow of ideas and makes the actual writing part much easier. So I advise a lot of graduate students in psychology, and I always teach them to create an outline when they're writing their papers. And when they go through the process of writing their master's thesis and their doctoral dissertation, I walk through the outlining process with them, and they find it valuable as well. Let's talk a little bit about the overall introduction flow. So step one is to lay out the research question. You're going to build to it through your literature review later, but you want to start with an overall paragraph to introduce your research question. In this overview paragraph, you're going to explain why this problem or question is important and why this particular study should be done. In other words, why should we care about this topic? Why is it important, and what will your study add? You also want to create a broad overview of your hypotheses in this introduction part. So basically you're starting with a paragraph or paragraphs that provide a snapshot or overview for the reader of what you'll be guiding them through in your introduction and what you're going to study. Then you get into explaining your specific study constructs and summarizing past research on those constructs that you found in your literature review. So in that part, number 2, you include the results of your literature review. You clearly define your constructs, oftentimes citing research to provide definitions that other researchers have used that are commonly accepted for your constructs. And you also state what you found in your literature search about each of your constructs. Number 3, you build the argument for your hypotheses. So after you have provided your snapshot overview in number 1, and you've gone through each of your study constructs and explained what they are and summarized past research, then you get into the argument specifically for why you are proposing the hypotheses in the way that you are. So in that part 3, it's really important to bring in theory and other research and explain the logic in your own words. Number 4, you finish your introduction section by stating your hypotheses at the end. So this should flow logically from number 3, where you're explaining why you are proposing the hypotheses that you are, including that logic. Then you finish the introduction with your actual hypotheses. The following slides will provide you with an introduction to the way that you structure your introduction. You start with opening paragraphs, similar to the one that I will show you. The opening paragraphs are often the toughest to write. They provide the reader with a roadmap for the entire introduction. So I oftentimes tell students to hold off and not write the first few paragraphs until you have more done on your paper. And you'll see that in your outline assignment, I'm not asking you to outline your first paragraph because I don't expect that you're ready to have that completed at this point. In order to really do a good job writing that opening paragraph or paragraphs, you need to have a lot of your literature review completed, and you need to have your hypotheses set. For this reason, like I said, you do not include those opening paragraphs in your outline assignment. Again, you end with your 2 hypotheses, and what goes in between the opening paragraph and the hypotheses at the end? Well, like I said before, your construct definitions, your literature review of research on those particular constructs, and an explanation of why you are proposing the hypotheses in the way that you are. So making the case for your hypotheses. In the next few slides, I'm going to provide you with some more information on writing that opening paragraph. And I know that this isn't due quite yet for you, but I do want to provide sort of some information about it so that you know what's coming up later down the line. Again, the opening paragraphs, the first 1, 2, or 3 paragraphs in your paper provide an overview of your entire study for your reader, and they provide a general, what we call, roadmap of your introduction section. They give a general statement about your research question, along with a statement about why this research question is important, with a rationale. So in other words, why should we care about this? There are several ways in which a study might be considered important. So I've outlined some here in this slide. First of all, from a theoretical standpoint. So do we need to test a theory? Do we need to advance a theory? Add a piece to the theory that's not there? Or maybe just test a theory because there hasn't been enough tests of that theory. Maybe in terms of its contribution to the research literature. So perhaps you're proposing to test something in a slightly new way, and that hasn't been done before. So maybe people have answered that particular research question before, but in a different way, and you feel that it's important to use this different method. If it has been studied before, and the answer to that is yes, then you need to provide some rationale for why we should study it again. There might be limitations of prior studies. Maybe those prior studies are done on samples that aren't representative of the population that you're interested in. Maybe there are methodological limitations and you feel that a different method is more appropriate to study this particular topic. Maybe the theory that was used is a different theory than the one that you have in mind, and so you would like to examine this particular theory. So if the answer to the question of has it been studied before is no, then you need to think about answering the question, why should it be studied? So what is it about this topic that makes you feel that it's important? Is it generally important to society? For instance, is it important to know about to help better people's lives in some way? Is it important in terms of its practical knowledge or application? Is it a study that will have implications for the way that people go about or do things? These are just some examples, and the main point is that you can articulate why it's important for you to be studying this particular topic. The next piece is an explanation of why you are proposing your specific hypotheses the way that you are. So how are you making the case? You'll hear me say this term, making the case, throughout the semester. So you're really making a case for why you're proposing your hypotheses. You also want to provide a brief definition or overview of key study constructs and a general overall statement of your study hypotheses in sentence form. So in other words, when you're stating your study hypotheses in APA style at the end of your introduction, you'll have something that says hypothesis 1, colon, and your hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, colon, hypothesis 2. In your introduction paragraphs, you're just writing them out in a more sentence form that belongs in a paragraph. Here's a sample opening paragraph for you to take a look at. And what I've done here is they make the text different colors depending on what I'm addressing in that part, corresponding with what is on slide 5. So 1 and 2 are the research question and why it's important. So 1 is the research question, 2 is why it's important. So in the red here, we can see that it says keeping workers safe and helping them avoid workplace injuries is critical to workers, their families, and the organizations that employ them. So that's the research question. What factors affect worker injuries on the job? So that's kind of giving an overview of what I'm studying here. I'm studying what factors affect worker injuries on the job. And I'm stating why that's important, because we want to help keep workers safe and we want to avoid workplace injuries. So by understanding what affects worker injuries, we can help workplaces avoid injuries from occurring. In the green text, we have more about the importance and also making the case for the hypotheses and definitions of key constructs, like I have on slide 5. So here I say psychological research demonstrates that having a positive safety climate or demonstrating a priority or value for worker safety on the job is one key factor in preventing worker injuries. Management commitment to safety, which refers to managers' demonstrated value of and commitment to workers' physical safety. So note here that I'm defining one of my study constructs, which is management commitment to safety, is the most important dimension of safety climate in that it predicts worker safety behaviors and injuries in a wide variety of jobs. In addition, teamwork, or how well workers work together to achieve common goals, so there's my definition of teamwork, my other study construct, is important in protecting worker safety. However, while many studies link teamwork in healthcare settings to patient safety, evidence linking teamwork to worker safety is lacking. Okay, so I'm stating why this study is important. I'm making the case by saying that previous research has not looked at teamwork to worker safety. In the purple, I continue that line of thought by saying this study addresses this gap, the gap being that there are no studies of worker safety and teamwork together, by proposing that better teamwork and higher levels of management commitment to safety are both associated with fewer worker injuries. So that's summarizing my hypotheses right there. So note that I don't have hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, but I've put them both into one sentence, and I said better teamwork and higher levels of management commitment to safety are both associated with fewer worker injuries. So in this case, I would have teamwork and management commitment to safety as my predictors and worker injuries as my outcome variable. Using social exchange theory, I propose that high levels of teamwork and management commitment to safety will both engender positive safety-related attitudes and behaviors among workers in exchange, ultimately leading to fewer worker injuries. So in that, I am just briefly explaining the theory that I'm using, the rationale for why I am proposing that those two predictor variables, teamwork and management commitment to safety, will ultimately lead to fewer worker injuries. All right, so at this point, you can pause the video if you'd like to complete an activity on opening paragraph. On a sheet of paper, you can write down your research question. Go through the example provided and write some ways that you can address number 2, the importance of your research topic based on what you have found in your literature search. For number 3, go through the example provided and write some ways that you can address number 3 from the previous slides based on what you found in your literature search. So number 2 is the importance. Number 3 is making the case for your hypotheses. This is not to hand in as an assignment, but to get you thinking. If you have any questions about how to do this or you're struggling with it, bring it to your group meeting with me or my office hours on Thursdays at 10, or feel free to email me. Okay, so that was a overview of what you're going to do in that first paragraph or paragraphs in your paper. Let's get back to the other pieces of your outline. So remember, we're not including the opening paragraphs in our outline, but we are including these other things here. In this next part, you are providing what you found in your literature review on your study variables. So remember, like we talked about in our last video, that you have 3 variables, 2 hypotheses and 3 variables. So number 1, provide a review of what you found in the psychological literature in your PsycInfo Lit Search about your variable number 1. So thoroughly define your construct or your variable number 1, citing research papers, and describe the results of your literature review. So what did you find about this particular variable? Include, again, citations to research studies and any relevant theory. Number 2, this is basically the same thing that I just explained, but you're doing it for variable number 2. And number 3 is the same thing for variable number 3. So you're having these 3 sections of your outline where you're providing a definition for the variable with citations and the results of your literature review. So what did you find in terms of this particular study variable? What are some of the major things that predict this variable? Or what are some of the major outcomes of this variable? What does this variable relate to? Same with your other 2 study variables. In the next part of your outline, you are tying it all together, and this leads up to your study hypotheses. So in this section, you tie together your predictor variables and your outcome variables. And your goal is to provide a rationale for why you are proposing the hypotheses that you are. You want to include theory here, of course, like we've been talking about throughout the semester. You may have already introduced theory in previous paragraphs when you were explaining each of your study constructs, but you want to go into detail in this later section about why, according to those theories, you expect what you do in your hypotheses. You want to make sure you have a logical argument for your hypotheses. So state in your own words why you expect variable A to positively relate to variable B, or group 1 to have higher levels on something than group 2. In other words, make the case for your hypotheses and state your hypotheses at the end of that section. In terms of an overall outline, this is what you have. I realize the text is pretty small on this slide, but I wanted to give you a glimpse of how it all goes together overall. So you start with your opening paragraphs, then you provide paragraphs about your variable number 1, then you provide paragraphs about your variable number 2, then you provide paragraphs about your variable number 3, then you provide paragraphs to tie together your predictor variables and your outcome variables, or your independent and dependent variables if you are proposing an experimental study. In terms of your outline assignment that you have due this week, you want to provide a review of what has been found in the psychological literature about your construct 1. Then you provide a review of what has been found about your construct number 2, and the same about your construct number 3. Then you want to provide some paragraphs tying together your variables and proposing your specific hypotheses. So just to be clear, you are not including your overview paragraphs in your outline assignment. Like I said earlier, you're just providing this part here, paragraphs for variable 1 with definitions, citations, and lit review results. Same for variable number 2, same for variable number 3, and then paragraphs to tie together your variables and to propose your hypotheses. I put together some common mistakes that I have seen students make on the outline assignment here. So one is not incorporating prior feedback into future assignments. So make sure that if you have received feedback from me about a previous assignment, that you're reading that feedback and incorporating it into things that you submit in the future. Another common issue is simply describing specific studies and not incorporating them into the paper flow. So you have to make sure that you're connecting the points that you're making to the theme of the section you're working on and the paper as a whole. So you're not including just sort of random facts, but that you're making it clear that what's going into a particular section relates to the overall theme for that section. Another common issue is not describing variables in enough detail when you're defining your variables. So try to be very specific when you're describing or defining your variables, and use references, so cite research articles when you're doing so. So something might seem very straightforward to you. Let me think of an example. Like, let's use the variable of job performance. How do you define job performance? Well, it's the degree to which you perform your job tasks successfully, right? But how do researchers study it? How do they understand job performance? It's usually some kind of subjective ratings within the organization. It could also be objective ratings, like dollars of sales that are earned for the employee, or number of days that the employee has gone without being absent from work, something like that. So there are different ways that you can define job performance. So make sure that you're providing good detail on what your construct is, what are you actually studying, and cite research articles when you're doing that. Another common issue is failing to provide general information about each of your variables. So I see students sometimes falling into a pattern of focusing just on their specific hypotheses or research questions. So for instance, if I am studying the relationship between conscientiousness and job performance, students may only focus on research that includes both of those variables at the same time. And what I'm actually looking for in this paper is in certain sections, when you're describing each variable individually, for you to provide an overview of the research on each of those variables by themselves. So, for instance, I might look up conscientiousness, and then I see that it is part of what we call the 5-factor model of personality. And then I might see other things that conscientiousness has been known to predict besides job performance. I can talk about all that stuff, and that would be totally appropriate and correct for me to do so in my section on conscientiousness. So it doesn't have to be just about how conscientiousness relates to job performance. Although that is my ultimate goal, I don't have to include that only information on that throughout the entire paper. That comes later when I'm doing the tying it together section, and I explain my theory as to why I think they're related and previous research that finds that they're related, and then I end up proposing my hypotheses.